when you think about Vikings, the image that probably pops into your head is, well, fierce warriors, right? Maybe those dragon prow ships, explorers heading out into the unknown. It's all adventure and raids.
Yeah, that's definitely the dominant picture. And, there's a lot of truth to it. They were incredibly formidable fighters, amazing explorers.
But looking through this stack of sources you've brought, museum notes, bits from academic papers, historical accounts, it really paints a much more complex picture, and frankly, parts of it are quite uncomfortable. There's this whole other dimension to the Viking Age, something that wasn't just like a side thing, but actually powered their expansion, built their wealth, made those huge connections across the world possible.
And it's an aspect that often gets glossed over, maybe because it forces us to confront some darker realities.
Exactly, and that dimension is trade, an incredibly sophisticated, really expansive network of trade.
That's it. The sources are crystal clear. Vikings weren't just taking stuff. They were deeply involved in exchange, in commerce, on a massive international scale.
So that's what this deep dive is all about. We're using these sources as our map to explore this less talked about side. We'll unpack the Viking economy, look at the trade routes, their sheer scale, what they traded, how.
And then we need to zoom in.
Right. Zoom in on one specific commodity that was arguably crucial to their whole system. And this is where it gets really dark. People. Slaves. Or as they called them, thralls.
Our goal here, using these historical fragments and scholarly takes, is to piece together a clearer picture of what the Viking Age was really built on. Not just the raids, but this complex mix of trade, wealth, and, yes, human bondage.
So get ready for maybe a fuller picture, definitely a more challenging one than the usual story. A look at the powerful economic engine humming beneath that warrior image.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Right, let's start by hammering home that point from the sources. Vikings were skilled, very successful traders, not just raiders. It's a key distinction.
Because raiding is one thing, but trade is, well, it's ongoing, requires different skills.
Yeah.
Exactly. Raiding could be destructive, opportunistic. Trade. That needed organization, negotiation, establishing trust, building infrastructure. It was a long-term economic strategy, absolutely vital to their identity and power.
And the sources showed this wasn't just, casual swapping on a beach somewhere. They actually developed proper trading towns, purpose-built economic centers.
Precisely. Even before the big famous raids kicked off early in the Viking Age, you see these significant hubs popping up, both in Scandinavia and areas they moved into. They grew from older, maybe seasonal markets into permanent, often fortified places.
Location must have been everything, right, for trade?
Oh, absolutely. The sources really emphasize the strategic placement. They'd typically be on coasts, near great natural harbors, deep fjords, places their ships could easily reach.
Their ships were key to this whole thing.
The absolute lifeblood. These locations offered shelter, defense, and access to sea routes, sometimes rivers too, vital connections.
And who was running these places? Were they just like free-for-alls?
No. The sources tell us they quickly came under the control of local kings or, powerful chieftains. And these guys were smart. They saw the value pouring through.
So they taxed it.
They did. They set up systems to tax goods coming in and going out. And in return, they offered protection walls, guards, maybe some basic rules for merchants. It wasn't just random exchange anymore. It was becoming formalized, generating revenue, building power.
A kind of feedback loop then. Tax provides security. Security encourages more trade. More trade means more tax.
Pretty much. It fueled itself.
Can you give us some examples, names of these big trading hubs?
Sure. In Scandinavia and the Baltic, you had real powerhouses. Kalpang in Norway, Birka over in Sweden, and Hedeby, which is now in modern Germany, near the Danish border.
And Ribe. You mentioned that one started early.
Yeah, Ribe in Denmark is fascinating. Established way back, maybe early 8th century. It seems to have been a crucial gateway, kind of the eastern endpoint of a big trade network, looping around the North Sea. Shows this wasn't all new in the Viking Age proper.
Hedeby keeps coming up in these sources. It sounds like it was a really big deal.
Oh, Hedeby was arguably the biggest, the most critical center within Scandinavia. Its spot tucked into the Schleifjord. Incredibly strategic.
Why there specifically?
Because it controlled both the main north-south routes linking Europe with Scandinavia and the crucial east-west connection between the Baltic Sea trade and the North Sea world. A genuine crossroads.
Wow, like a funnel for all that wealth.
Exactly. At its peak, the sources estimate maybe 1,000 people lived there, which was huge for a non-farming town back then. And archaeology backs it up.
Also,
Big fortifications. They built this massive semicircular rampart in the 10th century. You don't invest that heavily unless something is incredibly valuable politically and economically. It needed serious protection.
So it wasn't just a market, it was like a defended economic capital.
That's a good way to put it.
And their influence wasn't just in Scandinavia, right? They set up shop elsewhere too, like in England.
Absolutely. Scandinavian Jorvik, they called it. It's a fantastic example. A major hub outside Scandinavia. The sources describe it as bustling, really international.
What does the archaeology show there?
It confirms it was a huge manufacturing site. Metalwork, textiles, carving bone and antler. You find evidence of workshops everywhere. And importantly, mints. They were making their own coins.
So not just importing goods, but making things in York and sending them out.
Exactly. York became a center for production and exchange, and its connections were vast. Back to Norway, Sweden, and from there, the routes went even further.
How far?
All the way to Byzantium, the Islamic world, using those big Russian river systems we'll talk more about.
What kind of stuff was actually moving through a place like York? What were they trading?
The variety is just amazing. Really shows how connected things were. York's artisans were getting raw materials from nearby and incredibly far away.
Like what?
Okay, so gold and silver from continental Europe, copper, lead from the Pennine Hills nearby, but tin all the way from Cornwall, amber for jewelry from the Baltic, soapstone for cooking pots from Norway or even Shetland.
Wow.
And then the luxury imports, wine from the Rhineland in Germany, silk, actual silk from the Byzantine Empire, probably for the elite, clothing or hangings. It really wasn't just basic goods.
Wine from Germany, silk from Constantinople. That really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? And you mentioned those Eastern European routes, the rivers.
Yes, absolutely vital. These were the bridges connecting Northern Europe to the megapowers, the wealthy empires in the south and east, Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates.
And Vikings were involved there too?
Oh, yes. Vikings, or the Rus, as they were often called, they set a key trading posts along the big rivers, the Volga, the Dnieper. Think modern Russia, Ukraine. Towns like Gorodish, Gnezdovo, Novgorod, Kiev.
Right.
They became major stops, often fortified, on this long haul from the Baltic deep into Asia.
Did these towns stay important throughout the whole period?
Not all of them, no. The sources suggest some Baltic centers, like Burka, started to decline a bit after 1000 AD or so.
Why was that?
Probably a mix of things. Maybe a broader economic shift towards bulk goods, which favored different kinds of ports or ships. And also, royal power was getting stronger in Scandinavia. Kings might have wanted to centralize trade, control it more directly from other locations.
Okay, so these weren't random markets. Deliberate, defended, taxed nodes in a truly massive network. And the scale. You mentioned the distances.
The sources really stressed their seafaring skills. That's what made it all possible. Their ships, their navigation, allowed them to build routes covering just vast distances. We're talking something like 8,000 kilometers.
8,000 kilometers? In the, 9th, 10th centuries? That's just staggering.
From North America in the west, basically, all the way to West Asia.
Incredible. What were the main highways of this network?
Well, as we touched on, those huge Eastern European rivers were probably the most famous, maybe the most significant. The Volga and the Dnieper.
Connecting the north to?
Directly to the big players. Constantinople, capital of Byzantium, cities in the Levant like Jerusalem, deep into the Islamic world, Baghdad, the Caspian Sea. They basically plugged northern Europe into the end of the Silk Road.
Whoa. So Vikings weren't just trading Nordic stuff out, they were bringing Eastern goods in, acting as middlemen.
Big time. These routes brought incredibly valuable things from the Far East into Scandinavia and then on into Western Europe. Spices, silks, precious stones, fancy glass. But maybe even more important for the Viking economy itself.
Silver.
A flood of silver, mostly Arab coins coming north. Huge amounts.
We definitely need to talk more about that silver. Were there other major routes besides the eastern ones?
Oh, yeah. Routes also went south to the Mediterranean, some overland through Central Europe, others sailing right around Spain and Portugal.
What were they after there?
Sources mention maybe minerals initially in Iberia. Spain had mines. And this is where it gets murky, that line between trade and raid.
How so? Did they raid first, then trade?
Often, yeah. The sources suggest they might hit an area first, show their strength, maybe disrupt things, then establish trade, possibly on better terms for them because people knew what they were capable of. It wasn't always friendly market day.
So the raids probably followed the trade routes too. Easier targets.
Highly likely. The paths were known, the wealthy spots were known. It makes sense raids would follow those established arteries.
And you mentioned this Viking activity, both trade and raids, might have actually kind of kick-started the European economy after Rome's decline.
That's a really interesting point the sources make. After the Western Roman Empire faded, Yeah, a lot of Europe went back to bartering, coinage dropped off, Viking activity, both the trading and the raiding, which did move wealth around, even violently helped pump coins and valuable goods back into the system.
So unintentionally, maybe, they were economic catalysts.
In a complex, sometimes brutal way, yes. They helped reconnect disparate parts of Europe economically.
And doing all this required not just knowing the way, but having the right tools, the right ships, specifically for cargo.
Right. We always picture the longship for raiding, but the sources point to the Gnar, becoming really important around 1000 AD. These weren't warships, they were purpose-built cargo haulers.
How was it on Nard different? Why was it better for trade?
Wider, deeper, higher sides. Much better for carrying lots of heavy stuff in open seas. Probably didn't need as many rowers, relied more on sail. The sources suggest they could carry maybe 24 tons, maybe more. A big step up for moving bulk goods long distances.
So the Gnar was like the freight train of the Viking Age, enabling bigger scale trade.
Pretty much. A key technological piece for their commercial success. And these ships, these routes, they weren't just carrying goods.
Ideas, too.
Yeah, and culture, technology. The sources note how this connectivity also helped slowly spread things like Latin and eventually Christianity into Scandinavia and the Baltic. Trade routes are information highways, too.
Okay, let's dig into the actual economic system. The sources call it a bullion economy. What does that mean practically?
Right, so a bullion economy isn't based on coins having a set face value guaranteed by a king. Instead, things are paid for using precious metals, mainly silver for the Vikings, a bit of gold exchanged purely by weight.
So the value is just the metal itself, how much it weighs.
Exactly, how much it weighs and how pure it is. That's what mattered. It's a really flexible system, especially early on, because you don't need a central mint controlling everything.
So you could use broken jewelry? Or just lumps of silver?
Absolutely. Coins were used, sure, but so were ingots, rings, bracelets, arm rings, even chopped up bits of silver. By the 9th century, silver was the standard measure of wealth across their whole network.
Where did they get so much silver? It sounds like tons of it was flowing around.
The amount is staggering. Initially, the vast majority came pouring out of the Islamic world, rich silver mines there.
How much are we talking?
Well, just as an example, the sources mention finds like over 80,000 silver Arab coins found in hoards just on Gotland, that one Swedish island. Another 40,000 on mainland Sweden. And that's just what we found. Think how much must have been melted down, reused. The total flow was immense.
Just incredible. So those eastern routes, the Volga especially, were like giant silver pipelines heading north.
That was the engine, early on. But the sources show they adapted. When those Islamic mines started producing less, maybe late 10th century, Vikings shifted focus, started tapping silver sources in Central Europe, like the Harz Mountains in Germany. They followed the money, basically.
Okay, so in a deal, how did they know they weren't getting ripped off? How did they check the purity and weight?
Right, practical stuff. Value was strictly about purity and mass. So for purity, they had methods like pecking or pricking.
What's that?
Making little cuts or nicks on a coin or a piece of jewelry. You could test the metal's hardness, see if it was solid silver or just plated over something cheaper.
Smart. And for the weight?
Scales. Portable scales were essential. The sources describe these neat bronze ones that often folded up, easy to carry for a traveling merchant. You needed scales and weights for every transaction involving silver.
Were the weights standardized?
A lot of them were actually imported, especially from the Islamic world, which makes sense given where the silver came from. You see these characteristic shapes like multi-sided dice or sort of flattened spheres. Some even had Arabic writing on them. That provided a kind of international standard.
But did Vikings make their own weights too?
Yes, they did. Often out of lead, maybe decorated with enamel, or they'd stick in bits of foreign coins or metalwork. What's interesting is these Viking-made weights were often unique looking.
Why unique?
Well, one theory is it made them harder to swap out sneakily during a transaction. If your weight looked different from everyone else's, it was easier to keep track of. A bit of anti-fraud tech.
Okay, so silver wasn't just money. It was also about showing off, right? Status?
Oh, absolutely. Silver was hugely visible. Wearing big, heavy silver jewelry, neck rings, arm rings, chunky bracelets wasn't just decoration. It screamed wealth and power. And it showed you were connected, because that silver came from far away.
Did outsiders notice this?
They did. We have accounts, like from the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, talking about being just amazed, almost awestruck, by how much silver the Viking elites wore.
And this connects to hack silver. You said they'd chop stuff up.
Yes, hack silver is key to understanding how this worked day to day. If you had, say, A bracelet that weighed more than you needed for a purchase, you'd literally hack a piece off it until you got the right weight.
Seriously, just break off a chunk.
Yep. Weighing these fragments, hacked silver, became totally normal, internationally accepted from the mid-9th century or so. Bigger deals might use whole ingots or intact jewelry, but for everyday stuff, hacking was common.
A very practical system. Do the sources give us any idea of what silver was actually worth, like exchange rates?
Yeah, we get some fantastic details from early 11th century Iceland. Gives us a real snapshot.
Okay, let's hear it. What was the value?
According to that Icelandic source, 1 ounce of gold was worth 8 ounces of silver. So gold was much rarer, much more valuable.
Makes sense. What about other stuff?
Well, 8 ounces of silver could also buy you, say, 4 milk cows, or 24 sheep, or a whole lot of standard wool cloth, wadmal, about 72 meters worth.
Okay, so livestock, cloth, it gives a real sense of value. And that same source mentions something else, doesn't it? Something valued in silver.
It does, and this is where it hits home just how embedded humans were in this system. That same source states that 1 adult male slave was valued at 12 ounces of silver.
12 ounces of silver for a person.
Exactly. It's chillingly specific, puts a price tag on a human life right there alongside cows and cloth, shows they were absolutely seen as a commodity within this bullion economy.
Which brings us squarely to that darkest aspect of their trade. We've talked roots, we've talked silver, but maybe the most significant commodity they moved wasn't metal, but human lives.
This is the part that really forces us to look beyond the adventure stories.
Yeah.
The sources are clear. The trade in people wasn't just some minor sideline. It was central.
So who were these people? The sources call them thralls. What did that mean in Viking society?
Thralls were the absolute bottom, the lowest social class. They were considered property, owned by others. They had 0 personal rights, 0 legal standing.
Property, like an object
Yeah.
or an animal.
Essentially, yes. That's how the legal thinking went. They were sometimes referred to almost like cattle. There's even linguistic evidence the sources point to in old Norwegian law texts. Slaves are referred to using the neuter gender, like objects, while free people were masculine or feminine. That grammar tells you a lot about how they were perceived.
Dehumanized by the language itself. Did they even have names? Family identity?
Often, no family name. Their identity was just thrall, defined entirely by their lack of freedom.
So how did someone fall into this? What were the ways people became thralls?
The number one way, the biggest source, according to all these accounts, was capture during raids.
So raiding wasn't just about gold and silver.
Absolutely not. Capturing people was just as profitable, often more so. Men, women, children snatched from coasts, monasteries, towns all over Britain, Ireland, Francia, Eastern Europe, the Baltic, dragged back to be sold or used.
Are there specific accounts of where they came from?
Yes, one source, the Fragmentary Annals, mentions Vikings bringing back blue men as slaves after raiding south.
Blue men.
The interpretation is likely dark-skinned North Africans, maybe even black Africans, captured during raids down around Spain or North Africa. Shows the incredible reach of their slave raiding.
So raiding was the main pipeline. But were there other ways someone could end up enslaved, even within Viking society itself?
Yes, definitely. Life could be harsh. Crime, for instance. The sources mention things like a woman caught stealing could be made her victim's slave as compensation.
And poverty.
A huge factor.
Yeah.
If you fell into deep debt, you might have to sell yourself into slavery, self-enslavement, just to clear it. Or, even more tragically, parents might be forced by poverty to sell their own children.
God, that's bleak. Selling your own kids.
A desperate measure for desperate times. And then there was inheritance.
How did that work?
If you were born to thrall parents, you were automatically a thrall, born into bondage. That cycle could trap families for generations. So capture, crime, debt, birth, all feeding this system.
It sounds like this wasn't just a small part of their economy then. The sources suggest thralls were one of the most important things they traded.
Absolutely critical. This wasn't incidental. They were incredibly efficient slavers, integrating captured people into these huge trade networks, buying and selling humans across their entire world.
Where did these sales happen? Where were the slave markets?
At the big trade hubs we talked about, Hedeby, for sure. Bulgar, way out on the Volga River in the east, was another major market point for people coming from the north.
And Dublin. I read that was significant.
Yes, the sources strongly suggest that once Dublin became a Viking power center, it turned into probably one of the biggest slave markets in Western Europe at the time, a collection point for captives from Ireland, Britain, maybe the continent.
Were certain groups targeted more than others?
Well, anyone raided could be captured. But the sources do indicate that Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe were a major long-term target for slave traders, not just Vikings, but others too. In fact, the English word slave likely comes from Slav, which tells you something about the scale of that trade.
Who was actually buying all these people?
Several groups. Within Viking lands, farmers needed labor for the house, but especially for the really hard field work that free people might not want to do.
And big projects.
Yes. The sources strongly imply that thralls provided the bulk of the raw muscle power for the big building efforts, fortifications, harbors, maybe ships, large farmsteads. Think about building those ramparts that took a lot of labor.
So they were literally the workforce building and maintaining Viking society's infrastructure.
Pretty much. They were the engine room. It's also worth noting, compared to Western Europe at the time, while slavery existed there too, the sources suggest selling your own countrymen wasn't as common as the Viking export trade in foreigners.
What did the church think about all this?
Officially, the Christian church wasn't happy about Christians being enslaved, especially by non-Christian Vikings. There's that really striking story the sources mention about a monk in Hedeby around 870. He saw Christian slaves being sold and was so horrified he apparently sold everything he had just to buy some of them their freedom.
Wow, that really highlights the clash of values.
It does. Shows the moral objection, at least in principle.
Can we trace the routes these people were forced to travel? It sounds like a vast human trafficking network.
Yes, the sources give a pretty grim picture. People captured in, say, Ireland or the Baltic could be shipped vast distances. Some sold locally, like in Dublin or Hedeby, but many were trafficked onwards.
Onwards to where?
To the big, wealthy markets in the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world, transported via those river systems, the Dnieper and Volga, through Eastern Europe, or by sea routes down to the Carolingian Empire, maybe even sold through ports like Venice into the Mediterranean.
So Vikings were major suppliers of slaves to the big empires south and east of them?
Huge suppliers. Someone captured in Britain might end up in Dublin, then maybe sold on to Moorish Spain, or taken across Scandinavia to Hedeby, put on the Volga route east.
And sold there for?
Sold to Muslim merchants, often in exchange for that Arab silver, the dirhams, and luxury goods like silk.
Did that eastern route change over time?
It seems so. The sources suggest maybe initially it went via the Khazar kingdom. But later, maybe early 10th century, the main route shifted through Volga, Bulgaria, then overland by caravan, a long, hard journey to slave markets in Central Asia, like Khwarezm, and eventually to Persia and the Abbasid Caliphate.
The demand, especially in the Middle East, must have been enormous.
It seems it was. Slavic European slaves, Sakalaba, in the Arabic sources, were apparently quite sought after for different kinds of work, even military roles. There's even archaeological hints from some Eastern European Viking sites, burial patterns that might suggest raids specifically targeted younger people, perhaps for this export market where youth was valued.
And this all loops back to the silver economy, doesn't it?
That's the critical link. The sources make it explicit. Slaves were a top commodity paid for with that Arab silver. That silver then flowed back north along the trade routes, ending up in those massive hoards we find. The demand for people fueled the flow of silver.
So, getting people to sell for silver was a primary driver, not just a byproduct of raiding for goods.
It looks very much like a core part of the economic model, which really forces us to think about the thralls' overall contribution. How vital were they? The sources leave little doubt. They were the backbone, the primary labor force doing the hardest, dirtiest, most physically demanding work.
Which freed up the free Vikings to do other things.
Exactly. Things like specialized crafts, long-distance trading themselves, fighting, running things. The thralls' forced labor made that possible.
The unseen engine.
Absolutely. The sources basically say without thrall labor, the Viking Age, the trade, the building, the military reach would have looked very, very different. Their exploitation directly fueled Viking prosperity and power.
And their value drove the raids.
A major incentive. The demand created the supply through violence. It made them incredibly efficient, large-scale slave traders.
Understanding this really changes the story, doesn't it? It wasn't just exploration and fighting. It was built significantly on forced labor and a brutal trade.
It's a fundamental part of the picture. We have to include it.
Let's try and imagine, as best we can from the sources, what life was actually like for a thrall. It must be hard to find their voices.
Very hard. But the glimpses we get suggest a life of just relentless, harsh work, day in, day out.
What kind of jobs?
The sources mention the obvious stuff, farming, tending animals, but also the heavy lifting, building houses, fortifications, maybe helping build ships, grinding grain by hand for hours, cleaning, hauling water, all the physically exhausting, repetitive tasks needed to keep things running. And where did they live? Usually in the worst part of the longhouse. The sources describe them often living at the darker end, sometimes basically sharing space with the livestock.
Literally living with the animals.
It really underscores how they were viewed as property, blurring that line. And treatment, often brutal. Very little protection under the law.
What about punishment?
Owners had pretty much free rein. They could punish thralls however they wanted. Beating seems to have been common, used for discipline or just coercion.
And sexual exploitation, was that part of it?
Tragically, yes. The sources are quite clear. A thrall's body was property too. That account from Ibn Fadlan on the Volga. It's disturbing, but he describes seeing attractive female slaves, intended for sale, being routinely sexually abused by their owners, often publicly. It shows their utter powerlessness.
That's incredibly hard to hear, but it drives home the dehumanization.
It really does. It shows the complete vulnerability, the objectification. Overall, the sources paint a picture of life for most thralls as likely being short, nasty, and brutish. Overwork, poor conditions, violence.
Was it uniformly awful? Or could treatment vary? Maybe some owners were less harsh.
That's likely. Treatment probably did vary. And the sources hint that maybe certain thralls had slightly better conditions.
Like who?
Perhaps attractive slave girls, or women captured who came from a high-status background originally. Maybe they lived in slightly better conditions. Also, male thralls with really valuable skills, a good blacksmith, a shipwright. They might have been treated with a bit more care simply to keep them working effectively.
So skill or background could maybe make a small difference.
Possibly in daily comfort. But, and this is the crucial thing the sources always come back to, it didn't change their fundamental status. Better food or a warmer sleeping spot didn't make you free. You could still be sold, beaten, traded away at any moment. That lack of freedom was absolute.
It sounds almost impossible for them to leave their own story behind, given their status.
It's a huge challenge. No legal rights, often no family name, sometimes not even proper burial. They didn't leave runestones or sagas.
So how do archaeologists find traces of them, evidence of their lives?
Archaeology gives us vital clues, even if they're indirect. Sometimes, grimly, in burials. There are cases, mentioned in sources and found archaeologically, where it seems slaves were sacrificed to go with their owners into the grave. Other evidence is more subtle. Looking at wear patterns on tools, does it suggest really heavy, repetitive labor? The layout of settlements, can we identify areas that might have been slave quarters, even if it's hard to be certain? Even the absence of things, like grave goods in certain burials, can suggest low status, maybe a thrall.
So even though they were silenced in many ways, their labor, their existence, is still visible in the physical world they left behind?
Exactly. Their work shaped the landscape in the material culture we find today.
Okay, so it was a brutal system. But was there any way out? Could a thrall ever become free? The sources suggest it was possible, if rare.
Yes, freedom wasn't completely impossible, though probably very difficult to achieve. The sources mention a few paths.
Like what?
Well, an owner could choose to free a thrall. Manumission, it's called.
Why would they do that?
Maybe as a reward for exceptionally loyal service over many years. Or sometimes, especially as Christian ideas spread, it might be seen as a pious act. Good for the owner's soul. Or maybe stipulated in a will, freedom upon the owner's death. Could freedom be bought? Yes, that was another way. Someone else may be family if they somehow had the means, or just a compassionate person could pay the owner the thrall's value in silver or goods, like that monk in Hedeby we mentioned.
Is there a concrete example of this happening, recorded somewhere?
There is a fantastic one, the Herning runestone from Jutland in Denmark. The inscription reads something like, Toki Smith raised the stone in memory of Sir Gisel Gudbrander's son, who gave him gold and freedom.
So Toki the Smith was a thrall who got his freedom.
Exactly. It names him, gives his skill, and records his liberation by his owner for Gisel. It's a really powerful, tangible piece of evidence for manumission.
Amazing that survived. So once freed, what happened? Were they suddenly just like everyone else?
Not quite. A freed thrall was called a lysing. The sources suggest they gained important rights control over their work, owning property, but they often still had some kind of tie or obligation to their former owner's family. Maybe owed them loyalty or certain services. It wasn't an instant clean break to full independence.
Did slavery itself eventually fade away in the Viking world?
It did decline, gradually, and the sources point to Christianity's spread as a major factor. As we said, the church generally opposed enslaving fellow Christians, and over time, those ideas influenced laws and attitudes.
It wasn't quick.
No, not at all. It's a very slow process. Slavery wasn't just abolished. We see evidence it hung on for a long time. There's a law code, the Codex Holmiensis, from 12,041 centuries after the main Viking Age, and it still has laws about slaves. Shows they were still a recognized category then.
Okay, now for that twist, that
Yeah.
layer of irony. We've built this picture of Vikings as the ultimate raiders, the masters of the slave trade, capturing, using, selling people for profit. But the sources reveal something else, don't they? They weren't always the ones holding the whip.
Exactly. This is where you see the brutal reality of the whole era. That line between perpetrator and victim, it could get blurry, even for Vikings.
How could that happen? How does a powerful Viking warrior end up enslaved?
Simple. When they lost. When raids failed, or when they ran up against enemies who were just as tough or better organized. Think about clashes with powerful Frankish armies, or Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fighting back effectively, or strong Slavic rulers. If the Vikings were defeated, captured,
They could become slaves themselves.
just like the people they captured, their enemies could, and likely did, sell captured Viking warriors into slavery.
Where did they end up?
Sources hint at captured Norsemen ending up far from home. Now, it's tricky. We can't say for sure that all the Vikings in, say, the Byzantine Varangian Guard got there via slavery. Many were free mercenaries. But the general point holds. Captured Vikings could certainly be sold into servitude, becoming guards, laborers, whatever, in distant lands.
So the very system they exploited so effectively could turn around and bite them.
Precisely. It's a grim irony, but it underscores the pervasive nature of slavery and capture in that period. Freedom wasn't guaranteed for anyone, not even the powerful Viking warrior, if fortune turned against them on the battlefield.
That adds such a complicated, uncomfortable layer to the whole story.
It really does. Moves us away from a simple, heroic narrative.
So let's try to pull this all together. What are the big takeaways from digging into Viking trade and the world of the Thralls? How should this change how we see the Viking Age?
Well, first, it's undeniable from the sources. Viking society, its wealth, its reach, was massively supported by this huge, complex international trade network. And within that network, thralls weren't incidental. They were a crucial, if brutal, commodity.
So it really forces us to look past that warrior image, doesn't it?
Yeah, you can't just focus on the raiding and exploring. You have to confront the social structure, the economic engine underneath. And a huge part of that engine was built on the forced labor of enslaved people.
So the final picture is complex and unsettling.
It is. Vikings were formidable traders, yes. There were also major slave owners driving this horrific trade. But the age was so brutal that sometimes they could end up on the receiving end too. Perpetrators and occasionally victims of the same system.
What does that mean for their overall impact on the world back then?
It means their influence wasn't just raids and settlement. It was also through these complex, often dark economic mechanisms, especially the buying and selling of human beings.
Yeah.
Understanding the thralls gives us a much fuller, if more disturbing, view of the Viking world and how it worked.
Thinking about all this, what particular detail about the trade or the thralls really stood out to you from these sources?
For me, I think it's that combination of the sheer scale, those 8,000-kilometer routes, the Norse ships paired with that chillingly specific value from Iceland, 12 ounces of silver for a man. It just makes their status as property so starkly clear within that whole economic system.
Yeah, that's powerful. For me, it might be that final irony. The slavers potentially becoming slaves themselves. It just says so much about power and how quickly it could shift in such a violent time.
It really does. And, this deep dive, it really only scratches the surface. There's so much more detail, more complexity in these sources.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to chew on after this. Think about those layers of exchange. Goods for silver, silver for human lives, and then that twists the powerful, sometimes becoming the powerless in the exact same system. What does that complex web tell us about power, freedom, economics? Not just back then, but maybe about how these things can intersect in any age.
It's definitely something to think about.